welcome to People Like Us, a podcast for and about third culture kids everywhere. I'm Jen Mohindra. I'm also a TCK, and I have a Facebook group for TCK adults called, unsurprisingly, People Like Us. Hello, and today I'm excited to have Christina Hoag on this episode of People Like Us. Christina, welcome, and thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm here in Los Angeles, on the other side of the world from you, so it's quite exciting.
Yes, London to LA. So jumping straight in, as I do, the first question that I like to ask all my fellow TCKs is, where did you grow up?
Well, of course, like most TCKs, this is a complicated question. It takes a few minutes to explain. It's not a simple answer. It starts with my mother's British. She's from Plymouth, actually, and she was a nurse, and my dad's from New Zealand, and he was a mining engineer, and they met in what was then called Northern Rhodesia, in a mining town near the Congo border. It was a copper mining town, and met, got married, and my mother was about 7 months pregnant with me, and then Dad decided he wanted his first child born near his family, so they got on the plane and went to Oamaru in the South Island of New Zealand, which is a small town. I was born, and then 3 weeks later we were off to Fiji, where Dad worked at a gold mine. Again, rather a primitive town. We were there for a while. Then he got a job with a Swedish multinational company that sells mining equipment and stuff like things. So we were in Stockholm for a while, and then in England, outside of London, in Surrey, which is probably where I learned to walk and talk and whatnot. And then we were in Nigeria, in Lagos, for a couple of years. And then we went back to New Zealand, to Wellington, which is really where I started school and kindergarten and all that. So that's really where my memory kicks in. We were there for, 4 years, and then went to Sydney, Australia, which was ostensibly our last move. And we were all, Australianized. And then Dad got another assignment that he couldn't turn down, which was to go to the United States, which he'd always wanted to go to. So we ended up in New Jersey, and I was about 13, and that was the most traumatic move for me. So that's why I'm sort of still here. We ended up staying here, and things happen and whatnot. And then as an adult, I ended up moving abroad again for 10 years to Latin America. So we can talk more about that too as we move on.
Wow, yes, quite a lot of moving, as you say. And you mentioned learning to walk and talk in England, which by that time you'd already done, had some good moves under your belt. You mentioned also the move to the USA, to New Jersey at the age of 13 being the most traumatic. That resonates. That's, for me, I had a tricky move at that time. I think it's a difficult age, and it seems to be a common response from TCKs that from the age of 12 to 14 tends to be the hardest move. What did you find challenging at that time?
Yeah, as you said, it's a hard time, of life for anyone. I think it's just at that brink of adolescence and puberty and whatnot. And when we got to New Jersey, it was just total culture shock. More than we'd watched American TV shows, the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island. I mean, American TV shows, are everywhere, and so we knew a fair bit about the States and whatnot. And one of the things that was sort of a shock is that Americans didn't know anything outside of America. They didn't, we knew about them. They didn't know about us, I suppose, just because they hadn't had Australian TV shows or TV shows from anywhere, really. And so, it was just the level of ignorance. Did you have a pet kangaroo? Are you from England? My accent's completely not English. And, but, to them it was the same. Then they got confused with Austria, if something,
Oh
if
yeah.
I'm in the Alps or something, that's, next to Switzerland, I'm outside of the world. Um, so that was one thing, and then nobody could sort of understand my accent, and every time I would speak in class, well, the whole class, heads would just swivel to like, who's talking, who's this accent coming from? I had the wrong clothes, there were no uniforms in American high schools. We wore street clothes, regular clothes. So I didn't have Levi's and sneakers, which is what, sort of the American teenage uniform, basically. So I had none of that. I had to get that. It was just the winters. I'd never seen snow, and we had really bad sort of snowy winters. So the climate was another thing. And just the pace of life, was we were living in outside New York City, so it was pretty crowded and lots of traffic. And my mother her stomach would just tie up in knots whenever she had to drive on these highways and things. So it was just it was a tough time really for all of us. And then just settling into a high school. I was barely 13 and I was going into ninth grade, which is mostly 14 to 15-year-olds. But I was so far ahead academically. And that was another thing. I mean, the standards of schooling were much lower. So I was barely 13, with, in cases, 15-year-olds, it was sort of an odd thing. But, but I think being a TCK, I think I tend to be more mature. So that stood me in good stead. But still, it was just, just the adjustment it was difficult.
It's interesting you say about the schooling. So that would have been the change from, I guess, the Australian system to the American system. And again, it's been a few people have sort of mentioned the difference in school systems and then finding themselves usually advanced for whatever system they're going into, which I know that happened to me as well. And I found that quite difficult. You said you mentioned that the difference in the clothes and your accent standing out. So what did you do to try and fit in at that age?
That was difficult because I didn't want to fit in. On one hand, I didn't want to fit in. I didn't want to be American. I didn't want to, and I would say to my younger brother and sister, "Oh, you're getting an American accent. You're saying bath instead of bath," and things like that. But at the same time, that we had, it's sort of a survival skill. It's basically you've got to fit in to have friends, and at that point for all children, especially teenagers, you've got to have friends, and you've got to fit in and be like them. So I think the biggest coping thing was just sort of forgetting everything that went before me and just trying to be an American teenager. And that's how I just had to play it. I just had to lose my accent, dress like, the other kids, and just, be like them. And that's really how I got through. But as I say, it was difficult because I was desperately homesick, wanted to go home to Australia, but we weren't going home, So I think that builds resilience too into the TCK character, that, you're forced to do these things to adapt to things you really don't want to adapt to, but you have to. You just push forward and get the job done. And so I think that really is, says a lot about character building, resilience building in the TCK character.
Yeah, I think it's kind of sink or swim, but
right. Exactly, yeah. And then
were you able to?
I was just saying, when we went back to Australia 2 years later for a visit, then we were suddenly Americans. We weren't Australian. I thought I was like going home kind of a thing, but now we weren't Australian anymore, even though we still had Australian passports. But, everybody said, "Oh, you're American." And of course, I didn't want to be American. I wanted to be Australian. I thought I was going home, but I wasn't from there anymore. It was just a very odd feeling of not being from one place or the other. And that was the time that I really realized it, that I was really from nowhere.
So how do you respond now to the classic hard question for CCKs when people ask you, where are you from? How does that sit with you these days?
God, yeah, I know. It's terrible. Because I kind of go when somebody, or even when I meet someone, I have to decide sort of in this big split second, is this person am I going to like know this person for a while, or is it just like some fleeting cocktail party thing, or is this person worth investing my whole story in, basically?
Yeah.
Because I go into the whole story, and then what I also learned early on is that people kind of looked at me blankly. They had no concept of living abroad or what have you, and then they would just change the subject. They wouldn't ask any questions, or they would just say, "Oh, were you in the military?" I'd be like, "No, my dad's not in the military," and blah, blah, blah. They just had no concept, or they would just sort of brush over, they would just kind of give me a look and then talk about something else. So I very early on got this idea, my background wasn't worth talking about, even as an adult. So usually I just said New Jersey. For many years, I just said New Jersey, and I never just would hint at it, where I was, my real story. And now, yeah, again, sometimes I just say, well, now I'm sort of embracing the TCK-ness more, since discovering the term TCK and all these Facebook groups and whatnot, that allow, have given me some sense of community, that there are more people like me. So I just sometimes say, well, I was born in New Zealand, I grew up around the world, or just I grew up around the world. Or sometimes I just say, yeah, if I don't feel, sometimes I still just say, well, New Jersey, it's just easy. I mean, it's just so much easier. You just get out of it, because that's something they can relate to. I found people just can't, as a TCK, you're not relatable.
Yeah, it's that energy you have to consume each time you're asked to think, right, what's the context? Who's asking me?
Right.
Which answer shall I give?
Right. If it's someone who's traveled a lot and is a little more, worldly, then it's sort of worth giving the whole response, because they might understand. If it's someone that's not really, that sophisticated or something, so I'll just say, oh, New Jersey, and it's just be done with it, because I know they're not going to really get it anyway. And again, it saves me energy and sort of that little prick of hurtness, or, I've had this interesting life, interesting childhood, but people just sort of gloss over it. So it's not, so I just get out of it. So it's still a hard question for me. It really is.
It's the perpetual hard question, I think, for us. You mentioned earlier about when you first discovered the term TCK, the third culture kid. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I had no idea. I don't even remember. I think I was looking around I stumbled across it on the internet. It was just like a couple years ago. And I immediately ordered the book. There's the TCK, the Ruth, by Michael Pollock and Ruth Van Rieken. So I immediately ordered the book, read right through it. And then I was there in the pages, it was me. And it's sort of a lot of it made sense for the first time in my life, that things that I had done or, didn't seem like other people just really made a lot of sense. And so it was like this huge clang of realization that I had, there were other people, and it was a thing, there was a third culture kid. I had a name, and I had this community, and I started finding these Facebook groups and whatnot, and joining in that. So yeah, but it was a huge relief, actually, too. I mean, it was just like, oh wow, I'm not alone. It was really,
There's more of me. I have a tribe, and that validation of feelings to know that, oh, this is why this is happening. And yes, there's other people like me.
yeah, exactly. Validation. Yeah, I felt validated and worthy. I was like, oh, okay. And here's all these people saying all these places they lived, and and what's great about TCKs too is there are no two stories the same. Everybody's got a very unique story. Even in my family, me and my siblings have unique stories because of our birth order. I was the eldest, so I traveled the most. So it's just really, it's fascinating to come across that, and just the similarity of issues we've all dealt with. It's just really, it's very validating and it's reassuring.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We all have such unique stories, but we have this common thread which gives us this unspoken level of understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it really is amazing. And yeah, I mean, my story is different than a lot of people's, and a lot of others are also different. But it's and I've been, and, you know, and I've joined all these groups, like international groups and whatnot, and I never found, even in an international setting, they were mostly adults who had come to the United States to work, or they were really more immigrants and things like that. They hadn't grown up like this. And there's a big difference also in that. They didn't get how growing up like this, the effect of it, or, you know. So it's very, the TCK is sort of hard to find on the ground level, you know.
Speaking of work, has being at TCK affected your career choices?
I think so. I mean, from a very early age, I loved to read. So I would just be devouring books. Enid Blyton's, you know, Secret Seven and Famous Five. I loved those books. And of course, I wanted to write them. So even, you know, I always wanted to write. And when I got into high school here in New Jersey, I discovered newspapers and journalism. So I said, well, that's a thing that'll allow me to write, and it'll allow me to travel, because that was my second thing. I wanted to write and travel. And so that's what I did. I went into journalism, into newspapers, and I was working at local newspapers in New Jersey for a while, like 5 years after I went to university. And then, and I was bored. You know, I was covering local council meetings and school board meetings, and, you know, these very local issues and courts. And I knew there was another world out there. And so I quit. I gave it up and went traveling. And I ended up in Spain. I went to Spain first, to Europe, and taught English for a year. And then I went to Guatemala because I spoke Spanish. I taught myself Spanish, and got back into journalism. And then I lived in Venezuela for about 7 years. And then I got into bigger journal. You know, I was working for freelancing for a lot of big media, Financial Times, Time Magazine, New York Times, big newspapers and stuff. So I loved it. I mean, it was really the high point of my career was doing that.
So with living in different places as an adult, how do you feel in different countries? Do you always feel like a foreigner, or are you able to like what feels like home?
Well, interesting enough, I wanted to go to places that weren't English speaking, because I'd mostly lived in English speaking countries. So I went to Spain and then the Spanish speaking countries. And it was sort of interesting, because here I can blend in. You know, I look American, sound American, but there I look very much a foreigner. I'm a gringa. And so it was like there, I didn't have to pretend to be, I was just foreign, you know, and it was so that was sort of a nice feeling in a way, because, you know, there was no mistaking really that I was from Guatemala. I was Guatemalan and Venezuelan. And so it was sort of you know, and again, I sort of stood out so as foreign, and I felt foreign. But the odd thing was, because I was not from anywhere, as you mingle in the expat community, the first question is, where are you from? And because I have an American accent, people say I was from, you know, United States. And so, so I just say yes. But and if I would meet a Kiwi or an Australian, they would say, if I said, oh, I was born in New Zealand, they would start talking about something in New Zealand that I had no idea of, because I'd only lived there as a small child. So I didn't really feel from there either, or from, you know, Australia. So it was just, again, I felt like completely moving in these weird worlds. It was just an odd thing.
So with the American accent and having spent some time there, what's it like then to go back to the States after having lived in other places?
Yeah, I really didn't want to go back. By that time, I had married and divorced in Venezuela, and I had a 5-year-old. So I put it off as long as I could. We lived in Caracas, which was a very nice place to live then. And I was doing very well on the journalist side, and every day was an adventure. You know, it really was. And I was writing all these great stories. But my son had to go to school. Schooling was a bit of a problem there. And I felt sort of I needed to make more of a, you know, a home, have a house and that type of thing. So I got a job at the Miami Herald and moved to Miami, which is sort of Latin American, if you will. It's all people from mostly Cuban, but tons of other Latin Americans there. So it was a culture shock going back, actually. And I remember walking into a supermarket and had to buy a Windex, you know, to spray on to clean windows and things.
Yeah.
And so I went down and I go to the aisle, and there's an orange Windex, there's a lemon yellow, there's a white ammonia, there's the old blue, and I'm just looking at, like, which one do I choose? I was overwhelmed with choice. I'm like, which one do I choose? And I was like, which one's better? You know, do I just go with the color that I like? You know, when I left, there was just one Windex, it was blue. And then I was like, oh, okay, forget that. So I went into the other aisle, which was cereals, which was here till, you know, this huge aisle of cereals. And again, I just looked at it and I was just overwhelmed. I couldn't choose. And so I was just like, oh, I had to walk out. I took my son. I said, well, we'll go back another day. You know, so it was just after living in a more, you know, environment where there's far less choice of consumer items, it was just really overwhelming.
Yeah, and do we really need all these choices?
Right, and that's what I said. And I said that to somebody. He said, well, people like choice. I said, well, so do we really need, you know, 5 different colors of Windex? Isn't one just good enough? I mean, you know, that's the way life is here.
I think that ties in also with particularly someone like yourself who's made so many moves. You can't be a hoarder and keep lots of stuff, because you got to, you know, you're packing up and moving on to the next place.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I've shed stuff. Every move you shed stuff, you know, and books. I learned very quickly, not books, you know, I had boxes of books, got rid of them, you know, they're like useless things to carry around. So yes, it's, you definitely get sparse in your accumulation of things.
Yeah, Kindles are a wonderful invention.
I agree. I read ebooks mostly these days.
So, with having a child, was your TCK experience something you thought about with raising your own child, as to, you know, whether you wanted the same sort of transient upbringing or to have had a more settled upbringing for children?
Well, it was funny because it's at times in my life I felt that, you know, having a more stable upbringing was really the way to go. But when I had my son, I really wanted to give him the TCK experience, or at least the travel thing, because it is an incredibly rich childhood.
Yeah.
And you do get exposed to all sorts of things. You don't just read about history, you sort of go and visit it. You're there. And, you know, I love traveling, and I still do. And I think it is one of the greatest educators. And, you know, this world is a fascinating place, and all different cultures. And, you know, nobody's right, nobody's wrong. It's just all fascinating to me. So one of the biggest, you know, again, my father worked for a multinational, so they moved us, you know, around the world. I didn't have that. So there was a time when I went through a period of guilt that I couldn't afford to give my son the moving around childhood, or afford to send him to the American school, the British school in Caracas, which are very expensive schools, you know. And I just thought, and I felt guilty about it, actually. You know, I did.
So I guess your child would have been in a different time. For us moving around, and I speak for myself as well, moving on from one place to another, we didn't have the technology that we do now. So were you able to stay in touch with people from the different places that you lived in?
Yeah, not really. I mean, you know, now I think the internet has made the world a smaller place, and it's much easier to stay in contact. I mean, now I'm in touch with, like, you know, my cousins on the internet, and they live all over the place. But back then it was, you know, writing letters. So I would write letters, and I'd get letters back from friends, you know, after a while, and then I'd immediately write back. But I wrote back too quickly. I didn't know that, you know, you should wait, and then I wouldn't get a letter for a while. And eventually the letters stopped. you know, I would always write back, and then the letters would stop. And I found that even though, you know, I could relate to their life back in Sydney, they couldn't relate to mine, you know, because they weren't here. And increasingly, I wasn't a part of their life, you know, even though I knew what they were talking about, but I just wasn't part of it. So it just naturally kind of died. But I always wrote back, you know, and I'm a great believer in writing back. And, you know, I did my, you know, at least I can say I did my part. And then it was, but eventually, yeah, it just dropped off. You know, and it's even with the internet, it is difficult to keep in touch because you just run into so many people. They're not very deep relationships. They're sort of born of proximity, more of maybe affinity. And but I am in touch, you know, again on Facebook and those type of things. Everybody's on there.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the depth of the relationships that you keep on things like such as Facebook. And I think about my own letter writing days of staying in touch with the friends. And I think there was a lot more thought and consideration into writing a letter as opposed to firing off a message or email on Facebook or something. And I think also, I mean, I like you, I used to write to many people when I moved on, and then as time went by, it sort of gradually filtered out and ended up just being 2 people that I stayed in touch with, from one from primary school in Kenya and another one from my high school in Australia, both of whom I'm in touch with on Facebook. But I think the relationships have changed as the medium of communication has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Now you can just write hi, or you don't even have to write anything. You put in these little emoji things, and
Yes.
you know, you don't even have to write anything, frankly. But yeah, I mean, maybe that was another thing that I liked writing as well, because I was always writing letters, you know, to family and friends and whatnot. So that was definitely part of my growing up that other people didn't have. They didn't have to write letters to anyone.
Yeah. To just kind of wrap up on a positive note, there's a question that I like to ask, which, as we're coming up to the 30 minutes now, what would you say has been the best thing about being a TCK? Or one of the best?
Yeah, I think one of the best things is I think it really stimulates curiosity and about the world, and a non-judgmentalness, and I don't know if that's a word, but yeah, non-judgment. You know, being open-minded, and at times I've had like very little opinions about things because I can see both sides of the issue. And later I've always thought, oh, I'm namby-pamby, but actually I think it's a TCK thing because everyone has something to offer. I don't, you know, I can't see the bad, you know, I see that there's positive things every place I've visited, you know, it's really things. And I think that's a good way to be, you know, if I think if more people were like that, we'd live in a better world, you know, I really do. And, you know, I don't think there's enough people who think like that, who have a global perspective and can see the good in the positive in cultures instead of putting people down as the others. You know, I think TCKs tend to see people are more embracing of different people. And I think the world could use a lot more of that, actually. And as I said, it was just, you know, it was growing up, we traveled a lot also, and it was just, you know, so a lot of great things, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that with the living in different cultures, we kind of have the opportunity to see people beyond the actual culture, and then see that, well, you know, we're all just people. We are quite similar, really.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think everybody's actually the same. We've all got the same set of needs and emotions, of human emotions. And then there's a layer over that of culture. And that's what people get stopped on, is this, oh, their culture is different than mine. Mine's better than yours. And and they stop at that. But underneath that, everybody wants the same thing in life. You know, you want to have a good place for your children, you know, have a good life for your children and be allowed stability, order, and the freedom to, live the way you want to live. And so many people just get stuck on this culture thing, difference rather than similarity. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Christina, it's been absolutely delightful to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It's been a delight. I love talking about TCK stuff, as I say. To me, it's just great to find other fellow TCKs and talk about our similarities.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to People Like Us. If you'd like to join an online community full of people like us, hop over to Facebook and search for People Like Us. You'll find my group, and you're very welcome to join us.